what does get lost when we translate from one language to another? And why don't we ever talk about what gets found? What do we mean when we talk about untranslatability? Are some things simply untranslatable? I'll leave those questions to sit with you as we welcome our guest. Daisy Rockwell is a writer, artist, and translator. She holds a PhD in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago. This year she was awarded the International Booker Prize for Literary Fiction for her translation of Gitali's Tree's Tomb of Sand. Please join me in welcoming Daisy Rockwell.
So these actually, if you look through, these are just 3 words for translation. There could be any number of other ways of describing translation in other languages, which means that we don't all mean the same thing when we're talking about translation. This is the English idea, is carrying across, but that's not necessarily the idea for other languages. And then I keep seeing this online, people keep sharing this poem, a poem on translation. Somebody want to read it for me? Yes.
Okay. I asked my friend, the translator, what was the first known act of translation in the history of mankind? His answer was, probably something into or out of Egyptian. I thought about this for a while and ventured a certainty. No, I said, it was when a mother heard her baby babble or cry and had to decide in an instant what it meant.
Okay, so this is a prose poem and a poet's interpretation of what translation is, which is again the kind of the interpretation. So she's imagining the first act of translation being a pre-speech act being interpreted into language and ideas. So baby is crying, does it want to sleep, does it want milk? So people love this quote. I see it all over the internet, and but whenever I see it, I get sort of irritated because, well, I'm a mother too, but I'm a translator. And to me, I'm a literary translator, and I sit down with one book and I write another whole book, so I feel like slightly irritable when I see this quote because it's so much more. Literary translation is extremely complicated, and it feels a little bit precious to say it's the same thing as hearing a baby cry and thinking, oh, does it want milk? Like that's, I mean, I can see why she likes the simplicity of it, but for me, I'm sitting here with these stacks of dictionaries and everything, so I feel irritated whenever I see that. Okay, so translators love metaphors for translation. And I just went online and found a bunch of random metaphors that people like to use. So here are a few. A hall of mirrors, because when you go into a hall of mirrors, like at an amusement park, you are sort of looking at your original self, but then it gets reflected back to you in all kinds of strange, wonderful, or scary ways. So translation is like finding that reflection. Horticulture, when you take a rare plant and then you try to replant it in some different soil or graft it, so you're like moving one thing to another place, trying to make it grow again in a new pot or a new atmosphere. A handshake, where two, like the translator and the author, are sort of shaking hands, and this kind of exchange occurs. These are all from translators, by the way, not poets. Transporting a group of people across a river. I like that because it's sort of like that, carrying across. So, but it also makes me think of the river Styx, like you get everybody in the boat and you take them across to the underworld. So there's like, in my mind somehow I add this ominous kind of shade to the whole thing. But yes, you put a whole group of people in a boat and you take them across the river. Conducting an orchestra is a good one. Thinking of the translators, the conductor, and the people playing the instruments are the words or the text. And the music that you're conducting was written by the author. So the composer is the author, the conductor is the translator. An actor interpreting a part, similar idea that a playwright wrote your part for you, but as an actor, you are expressing it in your own way. A musician playing music written by a composer, which is sort of like the conductor, only more individualistic. Dr. Jekyll as the author, and Mr. Hyde as the translator. That's a very sinister one, because if you think about Dr. Jekyll turns into Mr. Hyde when he takes this, what is it, like a potion or something like that, and he becomes this kind of monstrous, horrible being. So that was obviously a translator feeling super negative about their work when they came up with that one. And Dr. Frankenstein, I just added this off the top of my head. Dr. Frankenstein and his monsters, the translator is Dr. Frankenstein, and the monster is the translation, which is made up of all these parts, all these living parts, and you sort of put it all together, and you kind of hope it can walk and not freak people out, but maybe it will fail, who knows. Okay. Alright, so what makes a translation good? People always use metaphors for this as well. They don't, not meaning to, but they always use words like fidelity, faithfulness. So they're all like kind of, there are a lot of images of the translator kind of doing something to the text. It's like a little bit sexual. So like, first of all, you say, was the translator faithful to the text, as though they're kind of in this monogamous relationship, and the translator has to keep on the straight and narrow, or else the whole thing is unsuccessful as a translation. Did the translator take liberties, which makes the translator sound a little bit like rapey or something like that. So the way that people, like critics, and the way that non-translators think about translation is the translator is a little bit creepy, and the translator should be staying true to the original text. And if they're not, the translation is not a success, and the translator is probably not a good translator. And so what this is all prizing really is word-for-word accuracy. Like this sentence said exactly this, and then they put exactly that. As they like try to make it exactly word-for-word correct. But for literary translators, that's not actually the goal. The goal is accuracy is more like it's more about the entire feeling. So if you read a poem that makes you feel sad, but you could translate it word for word and it would come out not sounding very sad. And for a literary translator, that's not successful because you have to get the sadness in there. So what do? Then it becomes a kind of much more creative act than just transferring one word across at a time. You have to actually imagine what it is that made the other poem sad and try to recreate that. And then it's a little bit mystical because we can't always explain how we figured out how to make it sad. It's because it's like creative writing. It is a form of creative writing, in fact. And what I like to say is, regular creative writing is like, there's nothing in your way. You can just write whatever you want. Creative writing through translation is like very regimented. You have this text and you have to live with it and bring it across again. You have to interpret it. And so your writing act is all connected to this text. And I like to think of another metaphor, which is talking about free verse. The famous poet Robert Frost once said that writing free verse, meaning no rhymes and meter and everything, for him was like playing tennis with the net down. So it's just like all over the place. And he preferred to have the net up. So the translation is a creative writing act, the literary translation, where you have the net up the whole time. Okay? Alright, so now I'm going to get a little bit more mystical here. So, dhwani is a Sanskrit word. It's used in Hindi and in many Indian languages. And it means an echo, a vibration, resonance. It means many, many things. Alliteration and assonance can be deliberate and playful, as in a double entendre and punning, an accidental mishmash of sameness, or a mystical reverberation. So dhwani is like, technically it can be a music term, but it's also a literary term. And people, sometimes people do use it in common speech. word because the author, whose book that I translated, Tumo Sangeetanjali Shri, she talks about dhvani a lot in that novel that Bill had mentioned, won the International Booker Award. And dhvani became for us, she and I, because she writes in a very style that's very difficult to translate because there's lots of word play that's specific to Hindi. And so we started to think of translation as a dhvani. It's an echo between our two texts. Our two texts are echoing off each other. So any musical instrument basically has this quality of dhvani, echoes, ripple effect. And then I wonder, I keep skirting on this one word, vibes, or vibe. Anybody know the origin of the word vibe or vibes that we use so much in common speech? Anybody have any idea? Yes? Vibrate, yes, but it's something where it's actually referring to a specific musical instrument.
Vibraphone?
Yes, a vibraphone. And so vibes, like, because the guys that played vibraphones in the jazz in the 40s and 50s were super cool, and so the word vibes, they actually called their instrument the vibes. And that's how the word sort of came into our language as a kind of cool word. And this may or may not work for us here, but I'm going to, because I can't see the little, oh, here it is. Okay. This is just a little bit of the famous vibes player, Milt Jackson, playing the vibraphone. So I just want you to think about dhvani, and you can see the text here explains exactly what a vibraphone is. So let's see if this, can you hear well or no? So, as we go forward in this talk, I want you to think of dhvani and the vibes as what we're actually doing when we're translating, we're doing literary translation. And we get away from these like weird, kind of monogamous, heteronormative metaphors like about fidelity and so on. Okay, my big question, what makes something untranslatable? Does anybody have any thoughts on what would make something untranslatable? Yes?
A lost language.
A lost language, so if you don't actually know what it means, like these really old languages, that's a good one. Okay, what else? Yes?
I guess if it's a concept that doesn't really have an equivalent, like, word in the other language, and so you can't really say in a few words, and you have to explain it, like, and so it's just better to leave the thing untranslated.
Yeah, so like a concept that's really specific to that language, yeah.
For humans, like animal language?
That's true, animal language or babies.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes puns and other languages.
Puns, did you say? Yeah, puns and like jokes, things like that. Yes. Take one more, yeah.
Like slang, and words that aren't really words in the language.
Oh, right, yes, exactly. So, I'm going to show you now a list of, these lists are all over the internet, like, I'm sure you, I mean, maybe you have it, but when a translator, I always see these. There are all these lists of untranslatable words. I want you to read it, just read it to yourself for a minute, and think about why these are called untranslatable words. Give you like a couple minutes to talk about. I took this at random. They're like all over the place, and they're even books. They're like coffee table books of exactly this format. Okay, what makes these words untranslatable? I think somebody actually had brought this particular idea. Why are these called untranslatable words? Yeah.
There's no like one word equivalent.
Right, exactly. So this always makes me really irritated because so what, right? Like there isn't one word that maps onto, Tosca onto our language. Like we can't just say, we say nostalgia, we're not capturing the whole thing. But that doesn't make them untranslatable. These all have translations that are right there, right? Every single word is translated. So it always drives me nuts when people put these things up. Really, the difference is that there's not a word for word, and that shows a kind of a common misconception of what translation is, that we're translating one word at a time. Yes?
But you can't really stick that whole long definition in a sentence.
No, but we have our ways. So like I have, one example was the title of the novel Tomb of Sam. It's Great Samadhi in Hindi. And do any of our Hindi knowers know what Samadhi means? No, okay, so Samadhi is a really, you do?
Yeah, I know it means the end of something,
It's what?
like the ending of something.
Well, Samadhi, it's a huge word, like one of these, only much bigger. So it can mean kind of the final point in yogic practice, when you have reached such a state of meditative trance that it's almost like you're dead, but you're not. Like the Buddha, or like you hear about a great sage standing on one leg on a mountain for thousands of years or something. So he's in a state of samadhi. They no longer notice anything around them. It's also a word that is used for a tomb. Like, because if somebody sits in samadhi for a long time, it can become their final resting place. So for the title of the novel had this word in it, and I can't put all those things, like just as you said. I cannot put everything I just said into the title of a book because nobody would read it, right? So I chose one of the words, tomb, and then the word comes up a lot in the book. So in the book, I slowly teach it, the actual Hindi word, to the readers in English. So I use it as trance and meditation and resting place. And then I start to define it, like as I go along, because she uses the word over and over again, until by the end, I'm always using samadhi, and my readers by then know what it means. So that's why I'm talking about creative solutions. Like, yes, I can't put every single definition word into my translation necessarily, but I can tease it in through other places, and that's what translators have to learn how to do, literary translators. Okay, so I've just dispensed with the idea of untranslatability, but now I'm going to show you that there is such a thing. This is part of your handout. These are 4 untranslatable poems on Hindi orthography, meaning Hindi spelling. So Hindi is written in the script that you see on this picture of the owl. I made this picture to illustrate the poem. So it's an owl, and the word for owl is ullu. And ullu has 2 kinds. There's 2 u sounds in Hindi, u and oo. So ullu has both of them, lu. So these poems are about how spelling in Hindi works and how people misspell things or use the wrong letters. So that's obviously impossible to translate, because if you're reading it in English and you don't know the Hindi alphabet, you have no idea what they're talking about. So for the first ones, This is about those two letters, O and U, and how people get them confused in their spelling. And so I did 3 versions of this. The first, and I called the whole thing, so I gave it its own name, ooh, like trying to get English readers to think about that idea of differing vowel lengths, because we don't talk about that very much in English, but in Hindi it's very important. How long is the vowel? Is it short or is it long? In English, nobody really thinks about that much. So ooh is an ode to an untranslatable poem about Hindi orthography in 3 parts. Okay, so I want somebody who can pronounce Hindi words to read this. You only have to read down to like that space there. Who wants to do it? Hindi or Bangla, no one can read it. You gonna do it?
Sure.
Like, can you stand up because it'll be hard to hear you?
Okay. The word karuna means compassion and it's not long. As you can see, there's a short U in it, not a long one. Don't forget that the U is nestled inside the rock. Karuna means tradition or custom and is rather short. All the same, this word has a long U, not short, as with above. Make sure it is nestled right outside the rock. Those who are not aware, i.e. Jagaluk, mistakenly insert a short loop. Along said the R of Jagaluk, but being aware is really so is very important. And the way it begins is by making sure that it's a long U snugly up to the rock. And once you've made the necessary beginning, you must remember that in the word shuru beginning, there are no long U's, and that in the word zaruri necessary, the U necessary around is actually not at all short.
Okay, so I called this version the academic style because I tried as hard as I could to translate what the poem actually said. And then I dropped all these little footnotes under because academics, scholarly translation loves to put lots of footnotes. But as one of my mentors once said, A.K. Ramanujan, the famous translator, we always like to say that in translation, every footnote is a confession of failure. Okay, so and when I wrote this purposefully like this as a confession of failure, that is my failed version. Okay, so then the next one is I just ran it through Google Translate to see what would happen. Who wants to read the Google Translate? Yeah, please stand up.
Compassion is a very big word, but the volume of his R in the small h sound is the same. The word dogma is very poor, but the volume of his R in the big looks, who are not aware. They are aware of the R in small h, attaché. But awareness is vital, and it begins. Aware of the R in the big F planting. And once it became necessary introduction, then start RN. A big F does not, nor necessarily the R in the small u.
Beautifully rendered. Say that I'm just showing you my distinct Google Translate, but you can see what a mess AI can make of a literary work because it doesn't understand what the author was doing. Sorry, so the last one I'm calling it freestyle, but what I really mean is this is what literary translators do. This is how they try to bring a vibe across. Okay, so who wants to read my vibe translation? Yes, please stand up, please.
Compassion is a mighty big word, but it comes with such a tiny sound. The word conserve is quite ambiguous. If you don't add an ative, you might end up with jam. Those who are not woke would cross out the O and add 2 A's, awake. But it is very important to be woke, not just awake. And for starters, one needs to know the word woke does not begin with an A. Once you've got that first letter nailed down, you must remember that there are 2 T's in letter. And to hit a nail, you need a hammer with 2 M's.
So, here I just went totally, I'm sorry to bring the Hindi poem and that out. You've probably got the idea by now. Does anybody have any questions just from that? Because that's a little bit complicated what we just but okay. Great. So let's move on to from untranslatability to what gets lost in translation. And lost in translation, as I said in the description, there's some more stuff coming for you here. What lost in translation is a pretty popular phrase in English that people just use randomly for all different things. But it's also assumed, it's always assumed that something is lost in translation. So that like as we carry things across, we drop them. Like imagine taking your laundry out of the dryer and walking upstairs, and when you come back down, you see that there's like socks and underwear everywhere, because those are the things you've lost in translation. You couldn't carry everything, and you didn't even realize some of the time that you were dropping stuff. But let's think about it. All right, one thing that gets lost in translation is the entire actual original language and text. So if you read War and Peace, what's lost in translation? That book in Russian written by Leo Tolstoy is gone. Okay? So like right away, a lot of people don't want to admit that they're not reading that book. It's been rewritten every single word in another language so that you can read it. So every word was written by the translator, so the whole book is lost. Another thing you lose, and we talked about this a few slides back, is the feeling one gets from reading that particular language. And this is really important because there are a lot, like everybody, English is so huge. So people all around the world learn English, and people often start to lose their own languages as a result, because English is the language that will make you move forward and make you successful, and it's the international language. So when I translate from Hindi and Urdu, I have many readers who know those languages but have lost touch with them because of the hegemony of the English language, and also because of early deep history of the English colonizing the subcontinent, South Asian subcontinent, and forcing English onto parts of the Indian population. And so the languages that are mother tongues for many people, that they grew up speaking in their homes, they start to lose touch with them, and they only read in English. And so when they read my translations, they feel a profound sense of loss because they feel like the English is obscuring that original language. So there's a certain feeling that they wish they could get from the language that they're not getting. And this could happen in any language. I'm just talking about my specific experience. So for example, if you know French, if you read French, you may feel a certain way when you read in French that is not the same as English. And that's true of languages. Languages have their own feel, their own vibe, right? So that vibe is lost most of the time unless it comes through in the nature of the story or the text, or I often keep a lot of Hindi and Urdu words in the text to help readers feel that Hindi that was lost. Jokes, somebody brought that up. Jokes are really hard to bring across, and jokes can get lost in translation. And cultural references, like kinds of food, kinship terms, very hard when translating South Asian languages because there's a really elaborate system of kinship terms, and you know, in especially in American English, we just like call everybody by their name, so like just, you know, Bob and Judy. Whereas in a Hindi novel, everybody would be like the youngest sister, the oldest sister, the first daughter-in-law, and like so if I translate it that way, it becomes very confusing for English readers because they're used to people just having a name. So that's an example of a very difficult thing and something that gets lost in translation. So to illustrate this, I am going to show you another poem. This is a very funny poem by a young poet named Shubham Shri, whose work I love. And she wrote a poem that I called, I translated as Donald Trump was all hunkered down in his mosquito net. And I made this little illustration of him for that. And so this particular poem, I just like, oh, I have to do this, I have to translate this right away. And it wasn't until I got to the final lines that I realized that there was a serious translation problem in the poem. So, who wants to read? Yes, stand up. So this is for readers who are familiar with the film dialogues of the Bollywood actor Nana Patekar. Who here is falls into that category? Is anybody familiar with Nana Patekar, the Bollywood film star? A little bit. Okay, so this is, none of you really answers to this, but we're going to read it anyway. Okay.
All loops stretched taut, all edges stuffed beneath the mattress. No holes, no ribs, no tears. How pleased to see the psycho, all hunkered down, surrounded by mosquitoes, yet totally protected from them, thinking he'll never be thirsty, never have to pee. If he wasn't such a fool, he'd realize that the end result of every perfectly set mosquito net is next morning's fat pink mosquito. Nana Patekar totally agrees with me on this.
Yeah, so they get there and you think, wait, what? And I actually thought, I actually didn't know this particular cultural reference, and I showed it to a friend, and it's like, oh, yes, well, of course. Okay. So, this next version is for readers who are not familiar with the filmy dialogues of Nana Patekar, don't like excessive annotations in their translations, are familiar with the transgendered Hijra community in South Asia, and are relatively unconcerned with the casual transphobia expressed towards said community in contemporary India. That's a really specific group of people. And probably nobody here is in that category, but you'd be surprised how many people are. Okay, who wants to read this version? Yes. This is almost the same.
All loops stretched taut, all edges stuffed beneath the mattress. No holes, no ribs, no tears. How pleased he is, psycho. All hunkered down, surrounded by mosquitoes, yet totally protected from them. Thinking he'll never be thirsty, never have to pee. If he wasn't such a fool, he'd realize that the end result of every perfectly set mosquito net is next morning's fat pink mosquito. Nana Patekar won't too much. A fucking mosquito can make a hijra out of a man. And he totally agrees with me.
Okay, so can you see what's transphobic about that line? The second to last line. So Hijra is, the Hijra community is transgendered as a traditional community in India. So it's basically speaking about transgendered people. So what does he mean when he says that? Give it a shot. Yes.
It's kind of like emasculating.
Right, exactly. So like he's saying, you know, you can be the toughest guy, but the mosquito starts coming for you and you are emasculated. So obviously it's a transphobic thing to say, but it's a really popular line in a movie. But she, of course, didn't put that line in her poem. Okay, she didn't put it. She just said, Nana Patekar totally agrees with me on this. And so what did she mean? She the cannoli that we bought, or maybe this, I can't remember who bought it. But anyway, take the cannoli because it'll be good, right? So it's this but it becomes symbolic of a certain kind of callousness, right? That like, don't leave any evidence, but don't forget to take the good stuff that we want, right? But I've heard that phrase a lot of times before I ever saw The Godfather, and I didn't realize that he literally meant leave the gun and bring the cannoli with you. But if you use that phrase in a poem or something, you wouldn't necessarily be referencing the entire world of The Godfather. You would be referencing the vibe of that phrase. And this reminds me of another English phrase that is used a lot. Have people heard the phrase, misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows? Okay, or sometimes it's paraphrased, it's like politics acquaints a man with strange bedfellows. Yes. Oh, do you know where it comes from? Shakespeare. Okay. So people use this phrase all the time, and what they don't realize is that it's literally what the character means. His name is Trinculo, the jester, and he literally means misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows. So I have this little clip. Are we going, how long do we have? Yes, okay. So this is the sort of loathsome Russell Brand kind of character, but you can see in the end that he literally means this. So there's this like monster lion. I think we need better sound.
Whoa! Oh my God! I do now. Let loose my opinion. Hold it no longer. This is no fish, but an islander lately suffered by a thunderbolt.
So there's a storm coming.
My best way is to creep under his gabardine. There is no other shelter here about. Misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows.
So he's, oh now my sound went way up. Can you turn my sound down a little bit? So he is scared of a storm coming, and so he's saying misery, meaning his fear of the storm, acquaints a man with strange bedfellows, means he's going to crawl under this coat or whatever it is with this monster to wait out the storm, but rather than standing out in the open, right? So he literally means that, can you turn my sound on a little bit? Whoever's up there in the sky. I'm going to stand farther away. So he literally means that he is going to get into bed with someone strange because he's scared, right? But then this becomes, it's Shakespeare, right? So it becomes this phrase that we use all the time, and we are not referring, I need it down more. We are not referring to this monster and like bed sharing situation when we use the phrase in English at all, right? We just mean that sometimes when times are tough, you end up like sticking with people that are really undesirable. So like you can use it in your everyday speech, like, you know, why do you keep hanging out with Stacy? Well, you know how it is, misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows, right? Like because you're both going through something hard, or like everyone else in the dorm is even worse, right? That's that kind of context. Okay, so that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's really important to think about how cultural artifacts have lots of stuff attached to them, and we don't necessarily mean all that stuff when we're translating. We have to remember how much to get rid of, too. All right, so I'm going to segue now to what gets found. So sometimes cumbersome, inexact phrases can have a concise version in the target language. Like I was translating a passage the other day where somebody kept talking about how they had all these memories and there was this sweetness but kind of a painfulness associated with the memories. And that's all just one word in English. What? Yes, right? So I could just throw out that it was kind of wordy, and I could just put in nostalgia. So it's the opposite of all those untranslatable words. Sometimes you have the better word in your target language. Something kind of plain can come out fancy in the target language, generating a new meaning. And translation is a form of interpretation or reading and can add meaning to the existing text. Now I'm going to share with you an actual email exchange with my author, Ethan Kishri. So I found one of those things when I was translating. It was something cumbersome, and I said, oh, for every action there is a reaction. And then she crossed it out, and she said, it's the way of any action that it sets in motion a reaction. She speaks English perfectly, right? So she tried to correct me because it's not that she hasn't heard that phrase, for every action there is a reaction, but she was still stuck on the actual words she'd written down and didn't realize that what she really meant was this nice, happy phrase that lives in the English language. Do you have that second handout came out?
Yeah.
I need that. Here's a big long example from that novel where she's talking about Western culture and everybody else. So the word in Hindi for the West is Paschim, and for everybody else or the rest is Baki. She's using Baki and Paschim. So even if you don't know Hindi, you can tell that those words don't rhyme or alliterate or anything, right? So when I translated it, it suddenly sounded even better. Who wants to read this? This is a great passage. Let's read it. Okay.
Foreigners have been purposely overlooked so far. They are white people, the West. If you have them around, it's all about them, because the world is their oyster. They are the ones who are creating it and destroying it, but everyone sees them as the creators. The rest are perceived as destroyers, because they, the West, are the center, and the origin story is set by the center. The rest are the rest. The type, the decimal point, T, the zero, typing, 1 power, all come from over here. Only when they reach the West is they picture the view from the north. All the hues come from the West. Black, brown, yellow, the uncolored, not the colored, aim to be considered the one true color. The West and the rest. The former are reality, the latter dull, drab, worthless. Memory comes from them, forgetting from them too. They have forgotten ancient Greece, which they considered the origin of their thinking for centuries and centuries. It was the era to which time and memory were their own treasury of knowledge. Otherwise, how would the West have experienced the Renaissance? But it happened and took place in the West. So the Arabs ended up becoming the West as well.
Thank you. So you see, it with the West and the rest is super pithy. And it's also like her writing in Hindi. She loves rhymes like that, and she loves funny pairs of words. But she didn't actually have that funny pair of words when she was writing in Hindi, and I discovered it. So it's a great example of found in translation that extra things can come popping out, new meanings, exciting styles, and things like that. So now I want to pivot to something completely different, but not at all different, which is art. And some other projects that I was working on. I am also a painter. You've seen some of my drawings in the previous slides. I was asked to put a painting in a local annual show at the Bennington Museum where I live, and they wanted the theme to be snow because they were showcasing photographs by the very first photographer of snowflakes, who was the one that discovered that every snowflake is unique. So they have an archive of those photographs in the museum. So they asked local artists to submit snow paintings. They thought, oh, I love to do paintings with Urdu calligraphy. So I thought, I'll find an Urdu poem about snow, and then I'll calligraph it and make it look like snow. So that was my concept. And I asked it for my friend Aftab, who knows Urdu poetry really well. So I said, find me a snow poem, Aftab. And he looked and he looked and he looked and he said, actually, there aren't any, because Urdu poetry is very regulated and has to be a certain way, so only certain subjects. And so the word in Hindi and Urdu for snow is barf, but it means snow and ice. And in Urdu poetry, it's only used to describe the icy demeanor of the woman that you're in love with and how she won't look at you. So there's no snowballs or anything like that. So I said, okay, Aftab, we're going to have to make our own poem, the Urdu poem. And I talked him into reluctantly translating Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. Who knows this poem? I mean, has read it. Really, that song? All right. That means we have to read it. All right, who's going to read it? Somebody volunteer, yes. Can you stand, please? And you don't have to, the italics are mine, don't emphasize.
Okay. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. You will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkness easily up here. He gives his harness bell a shake to ask if there is some to stay. The only other sound is the sweep of the easy wind and downy wind. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. I promise to go before I sleep and not to wait.
Okay, so that's my Robert Frost. The guy who doesn't like playing tennis with the net down. So this is the painting I made, and I made it out of our translation, but we ran into some really weird problems that I think really show what I'm talking about with cultural artifacts and the way that a culture views certain words. So, for example, whose woods these are, I think I know, and to watch his woods fill up with snow. So there's a forest that is owned in this poem. There's a forest and it's wild and dark and deep, but there's an owner, right? So what Hindi knowers here can tell me what the word for forest is in Hindi? Tell me anything. It's an English word too. Jungle is the word for forest. And you can say one, right? But this we're doing it in Urdu, and one is a Sanskrit word. So jungle is the word. And so doesn't it sound weird to say whose jungle this is? I think I know. For one thing, in English, your jungle sounds tropical. But so when we're not translating it into English, but still the concept doesn't sound like fir trees and things like that. And then a jungle is by its nature wild, right? So we kept going back and forth, like, could we make it an orchard, he said. I said, no, that's not what he means. And in the end, we did use jungle. And then we had other problems like farmhouse. He doesn't literally mean a house that a farmer lives in. He means like an occupied dwelling place, because they're far from town and there's not even anybody living there. So we did go through ideas for that. And the downy flake, like, because that Hindi word in barf is so vague, that doesn't go in for like talking about the individual bits of snow. There's not really a term for that. So he had to spend a lot of time coming up with something like that. So then we got really into this poetry stuff. And I'm getting low on time, so I'm just gonna quickly show you, we did this Sylvia Plath poem. If you turn the page to Exhibit E, cut. And there were some really tricky problems, like the Indians axed your scalp. So for one thing, obviously, like what she means is Native American, but then if you made it in Urdu, Native American, it would be giving her sort of a cultural sensitivity that she's obviously not showing. But you also can't put Indian in Urdu because that would really be misleading, since it would mean something else to an Urdu reader. So that's my painting, and you can see the poem is paragraphed on her hand. And so now I'm going to my aha moment. Exhibit F. So this is a poem by Wallace Stevens called The Emperor of Ice Cream. It's a famous poem that everybody finds incomprehensible. And Aftab too found it totally incomprehensible, and I had to talk him into translating it because he said it's just meaningless. And I said, well, so what? Let's do it. So I won't read the whole thing because I want to talk about the image that I made, which was an example, a huge example of finding something in translation. Because when you take the word emperor in English and you translate it into Urdu, the word for emperor is Shan Shah. Then the word Shan Shah immediately makes you think of a Mughal emperor from the Mughal period of Indian history. And they are often figured in these types of miniature paintings. If you've seen them, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. And so you immediately think of a Mughal emperor when you say Shan Shah. And so then Aftab was going to use the English word ice cream, and I said, no, use the Urdu word, Hindi word, kulfi, which means ice cream too, but it's a slightly different preparation. So then if you call him the Shan Shah, a kulfi, this is what you think of. Like you immediately, that's what comes into your mind. And it taught me so much about how visual media and painting or drawing or, even filmed kinds of things can be a type of translation too. And it showed me in a kind of really, I myself made this painting, but I still feel this separation from it. It's like he was born out of that translation. He was born when the Urdu title was given to him, and he immediately came into my mind, and I painted it. And so I feel like he, for me, is the symbol of what is found in translation. We found this guy who loves ice cream and is an emperor. And you should read this poem on your own. You won't understand it, but don't feel bad about it. And then the very last slide was because one friend said after she saw this painting, The Emperor of Ice Cream, she said, I like to think of this Shan Shah, this emperor, walking through all the kind of the halls of American poetry. And so that made me realize that we had to do one more Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken, which is the last poem here. And so I brought this emperor and I put him in a New England forest because I thought, if it's in Urdu, if this poem is in Urdu about an autumn scene, then how is the Urdu reader perceiving it? We had a terrible time with the opening line. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. Here we have the jungle problem again. And then yellow, Aftab said yellow is sickly. Like in Urdu, it makes you think of jaundice and stuff like that. And I said, well, how about autumn? Can we use an autumn wood? And he said, no, autumn is like depressing. Autumn is dead, sad leaves. It's not this brilliant New England burst. And he said, why don't we change it to spring? And I said, Aftab, no. This is New England autumn. Hello, he doesn't get it because he lives in New York. But, two roads diverge in a yellow wood is actually very hard to translate into Urdu. But I felt like putting the emperor into the yellow wood helps the supposed reader in Urdu to imagine what he would see. And we ended up calling it a golden wood, because golden has positive connotations. So that's my nest slide. And we have 13 minutes that you can ask me anything you want. If you have anything to ask. Yes?
How did you become
I took a lot of languages growing up, and I actually studied Latin for a long time, and so you do a lot of translation in Latin, and it's really dry and boring. And so I always tried to sort of dress it up, and then when I started learning Hindi in college, one of my teachers said you would be a good translator, so I started trying it out. Yes, back there?
There are any biases that go into your translation, like not intentionally necessarily, but just things that come across in translation that are specifically used to your upbringing in a separate culture.
Totally. I mean, everybody is biased, right? It's subjective too. Am I saving races that in India there are like millions of bilingual people that are prepared to tell me that I'm totally wrong. So, unlike people that I know that translate, say, from Bangla to French, nobody's telling them they're wrong. But I'll have people on, on social media, on Twitter, say like, you were totally wrong in this passage. And so I'm always getting corrected, and I'm always asking people too. But you still are who you are. We're all subjective beings. And so you just have to do your best. It's like, it's like being not racist. Like you have to kind of admit that you're racist and then work from there to be as unracist as you can be. It's the same as not being a biased translator. Yes?
How many languages do you speak?
I only speak, that's a great question. One thing you have to think about what is an equivalent in your own language to this text. So for example, if it's a super contemporary, you can use American slang and stuff like that because American slang is all around the world now. But if I am translating like a 1930s novel, I have to pull back on that a lot and think about, not sound anachronistic. And then of course there's a question of like, if you're translating a medieval poem, should you do it in oldie Englishy kind of way? And there's mixed views on that, but you should certainly be willing to defend yourself. You know the woman who translated Beowulf most recently. Has anybody seen that translation? I think she starts out, listen, bro. So she went all out with, we're going to do it now. But you can kind of do that because there's so many translations of Beowulf that if people don't like bro, they can go elsewhere. Anything else? Other questions? Yes? Do I understand it? Yeah. Yeah. I understand it very poorly. I know a lot of Bangla speakers, and I know sort of how it differs from Hindi in a lot of ways, so I know I can understand the words I already know in Hindi, how they've been changed slightly. But I can't really speak it, so I can get like maybe 40% or 50%, depending on what they're talking about. Yes?
Does the way you learn languages or you understand languages affect the way you sometimes think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, because people don't all learn languages the same way. Like, there are some people you can just like, drop them in Moscow and they like start making friends and figuring it out, and they don't care if they make mistakes, and they like figure out how to kind of fast talk their way into the language. And some of us, meaning more like me, they have to sit there and learn the grammar meticulously and mathematically and build it out and memorize it and so on. And then there are people in between. So everybody learns it differently. And then of course there's learning in a multilingual environment where you just imbibe it, where it's just coming in. Because if you're a child and you're exposed to 5 languages, you will learn them all somewhat or more or less, bits and pieces. And you don't have to go through the pain of learning a language as an adult or even a teenager. Yes?
After what age is it too late to start learning language and control it?
Well, I'm 53 and I really have secret hopes for myself in Korean, even though it's very unlikely that I'll ever speak it, although I'm really understanding a lot in K-dramas now. But people say that you, like, after the age of 13 or something, your brain is hard and won't accept any new language information, but that's not true. I started learning Hindi when I was 19. And I know people that have picked up languages later in life, so it's more like how much do you want to do it and how good is your ear. If you can't really hear the sounds of another language, you're going to have trouble producing them, but you could learn enough to read it. So it just depends on your goal. Do you want to go and chat with people? Do you want to watch movies? Do you want to read novels? Those are all different goals, and you have to kind of, if you feel like you're not learning it as fast, you have to decide on your goal. Yes?
Translating a similar, like the same text, do you ever have competition with other translators?
Well, you have to get permission, copyright permission from the copyright holders, so there can't be, theoretically there would never be two of you at once unless the work is out of copyright, like Beowulf or the Bible, or even Robert Frost is now out of copyright and you can do whatever you want with Robert Frost. I just did, in fact. Yes.
It's about 8 months around in the US and I'm speaking English. So before that, like my native language is Persian and I read lots of books that like get translated into Persian, but the main books are English or Russian. Like
Right.
So I'm sure there are words that you cannot, as you say, like translate because they are like in culture.
Yeah.
So how do you do that when you translate a book? Like, for example, there's something in English, like it's a novel. Like we don't have any word for that, like in Indian or Persian. So like, what do you use? How do you explain it?
Well, everybody has their own ways of doing it, so sometimes they try for something close. You know, like here's a funny example. Who knows what a pakora is? Pakora. It's like a fried snack, an Indian snack. Okay. So I read some of the French translators' translation of Tomb of Sam. And I was really shocked to see that she translated pakora as beignet. So, you know what beignet is? So like to me beignet is a sweet thing, right? But she just went ahead and did it, right? Like so you can choose something equivalent. Like you could say it was like cabbage, a particular kind of cabbage stew, but you just say cabbage stew or something like that. But sometimes you just, if it's a whole novel, you can just add in a whole lot of extra words and nobody will know the difference. So you could say like, he went into his wood